My name is Samuel Whitaker. I'm 58 years old now, and I've spent most of my life in Wyoming. I've ridden through the country so empty a man could travel 2 days without seeing another chimney. I've slept in lined shacks, hunted antelope in early snow, and buried friends beneath wind-bent cottonwoods. But the story I'm about to tell you isn't mine. It belongs to a girl named Eleanor May Carter. I first heard her name in the winter of 1926 from an old rancher outside Buffalo, Wyoming. At the time, I thought it was just another frontier tale, the kind old-timers tell after supper when the stove is glowing red and the wind is rattling the windows. I was wrong, because every word of it turned out to be true. The story begins in October of 1887. Eleanor was 19 years old, and completely alone. By then, both of her parents had been dead for nearly 3 years. Her father had been killed beneath an overturned freight wagon outside Cheyenne. Her mother lasted another 11 months before pneumonia took her during a hard winter. There were no brothers, no sisters, no family is willing to take her in. When the small boarding house where she worked closed its doors that autumn, Eleanor found herself with a bedroll, a canvas pack, $26, and nowhere left to go. So she headed west. The Wyoming Territory was still a rough country then. Settlements set dozens of miles apart. Between them stretched hills, sagebrush, creeks, and enough empty land to make a person feel invisible. For almost 2 weeks, she followed wagon roads and cattle trails. At night, she slept beneath her tarp. During the day, she walked. She ate sparingly. A little flour, a little salt pork, dried apples she carried in a cloth sack. Every morning, she counted her remaining supplies. Every evening, the numbers looked worse. By October 18th, she had reached the foothills north of the Bighorn Mountains. The weather was changing. Anyone who has lived in Wyoming knows the signs. The air grows quieter. The wind changes direction. The sky takes on a hard silver color that seems to drain warmth from everything beneath it. Winter wasn't here yet, but it was coming. Eleanor knew it. The problem was simple. She needed shelter. Not for one night. Not for a week. For an entire season. She spent 2 days searching draws, ridges, and creek bottoms for an abandoned cabin. She found plenty of evidence that people had once lived there. Collapsed fences, rotting posts, the remains of old fire pits. But every structure she discovered had already surrendered to time. On the afternoon of October 20th, with cold rain beginning to fall, she climbed a limestone ridge overlooking a narrow valley. That was when she saw the cave. It wasn't large. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a dark shadow beneath a bluff. Most travelers would have walked right past it. Eleanor didn't. She climbed toward it through wet grass and loose stone. The entrance stood barely 6 feet high and perhaps 10 feet wide. The smell inside was cool and mineral-rich. Dry? That was the first thing she noticed. Dry mattered. Dry meant survival. She lit her lantern and stepped inside. The cave extended perhaps 20 feet before narrowing at the back wall. The floor was gravel. The ceiling low but stable. Most importantly, the wind couldn't reach it. Outside, the temperature was already dropping toward freezing. Inside, it felt several degrees warmer. Not comfortable, not safe, but possible. And sometimes possible is enough. She sat on her pack and listened. Water dripped somewhere deep in the stone. Nothing else. No voices. No horses. No wagons. No sign that another human being had stood there recently. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Relief. Small. Fragile. But real. She decided before sunset. The cave would be home. At least until spring. The next 3 days were spent working. She gathered dead timber. Cut brush for bedding. Hung a canvas tarp across the entrance to block the worst of the wind. Each improvement made the cave feel a little less temporary. A little less like a hiding place. A little more like a home. On the 4th evening, she sat near the back wall, eating beans from a tin cup while lantern light flickered across the limestone. That was when she began studying the stone. The wall wasn't perfectly natural. At least it didn't look natural. Not in one particular section. At first, she blamed the shadows. Then the lantern flame. Then her tired eyes. But the next morning she looked again. And the strange lines were still there. Faint. Almost invisible. Running across the limestone near the rear of the cave. Straight lines. The kind nature rarely makes. Eleanor touched them with her fingertips. Cold stone. Nothing more. Yet something about that section of wall bothered her. Enough that she couldn't stop thinking about it. She didn't know it then. But that wall was about to change the course of her entire life and uncover a secret that had been waiting in darkness for nearly 40 years. The next few days settled into a routine that felt older than civilization itself. Wake with the first gray light. Check the weather. Find water. Gather fuel. Preserve strength. Repeat. I've often thought survival isn't usually one dramatic decision. Most of the time, it's 1,000 small choices made correctly while nobody is watching. Eleanor seemed to understand that instinctively. The cave kept her dry, but it was still little more than a hollow in the rock. Every morning she looked around and saw problems waiting to become disasters. The gravel floor stole heat. The entrance leaked wind. The walls offered no storage. And winter was moving closer. By October 25th, the first frost appeared along the valley floor. Thin white crystals coated the grass before sunrise. When she breathed, steam drifted from her mouth. She knew she couldn't afford to wait. The cave had to become something more permanent. So she began improving it. She gathered pine boughs from a stand of trees below the ridge and spread them across the gravel floor to create insulation beneath her blankets. She collected flat stones and built a crude cooking area near the entrance. She found clay along a creek bank and used it to seal gaps around the tarp she'd stretched across the cave mouth. Each day the shelter became a little better. Not comfortable, not pretty, but stronger. The changes gave her something else too. Purpose. People can endure astonishing hardship when they have a project to focus on. Without one, loneliness becomes dangerous. And Eleanor was lonely. There were moments when entire days passed without hearing another human voice. Sometimes she'd catch herself speaking aloud simply to hear words in the air. At night, she'd tell herself stories from childhood while feeding small sticks into the fire. Anything to remind herself she still belonged to the world beyond those mountains. On the morning of October 27th, she noticed something strange. Sunlight was entering the cave at a low angle. The autumn sun hung lower each day now, and its rays stretched deeper into the interior than before. As she rolled up her blankets, the light struck the back wall. For a moment she froze. The lines were visible again. Those same faint lines she'd noticed several days earlier. Only now they were easier to see. The sunlight revealed subtle differences in color across the limestone. Most of the wall appeared pale gray, but one section seemed slightly darker. Not enough to draw immediate attention, just enough to feel wrong. She walked closer. The area was roughly rectangular, maybe 5 feet across, perhaps 4 feet high. The shape wasn't precise enough to be obvious, yet it wasn't random either. She ran her fingers along the surface. The stone felt smooth, too smooth. The surrounding limestone carried natural ridges and imperfections. This section didn't. It felt worked, as if someone had touched it long ago. The discovery occupied her thoughts for the rest of the day. She tried to ignore it. There were more important concerns. Food was becoming a problem. Her remaining supplies wouldn't last through November. She spent hours gathering edible roots and searching creek banks for anything useful. The practical demands of survival should have pushed the mystery from her mind. Instead, the mystery grew stronger. Every time she returned to the cave, her eyes drifted toward that wall. Every evening, she found herself studying it. The feeling was difficult to explain. It wasn't fear. It wasn't excitement. It was recognition. The sense that something important was standing directly in front of her while refusing to reveal itself. 3 days later, a cold rainstorm swept across the valley. The wind howled through the pines for nearly 12 hours. Eleanor remained inside the cave, conserving fuel and repairing gear. With nothing else demanding her attention, she finally decided to investigate. She carried her lantern to the back wall. For nearly an hour, she examined every inch of stone. She searched for cracks, tool marks, anything unusual. Most of what she found could be explained away, until she noticed the corner. Near the lower left side of the darker section, a tiny gap existed between 2 pieces of limestone. Not large enough to fit a finger, barely visible, but definitely there. She crouched closer. The gap appeared straight. Not natural. Straight. A chill traveled up her spine. Because nature rarely works in straight lines. People do. She sat back on her heels and stared at the wall. The cave suddenly felt different. Not dangerous. Occupied. Not now. Long ago. Someone had been here. Someone had spent time inside this mountain. Maybe years. Maybe decades. The question wasn't whether another person had once used the cave. The question was why. That night the storm intensified. Rain hammered the tarp across the entrance. Wind moaned through the valley below. Eleanor lay awake beside the fire, listening. Her eyes kept drifting toward the darkness at the rear of the cave, toward the strange rectangle hidden within the stone, toward the possibility that she wasn't sleeping inside an ordinary shelter at all. And sometime after midnight, another thought entered her mind. A thought she couldn't shake. If someone had altered that wall, what exactly had they been trying to hide? The answer was waiting only a few feet away. But Eleanor had no idea that before the following week ended, she would be staring into a forgotten piece of frontier history that no living person knew still existed. By the first week of November, winter had stopped threatening the mountains and started arriving. The mornings came colder. The shadows lasted longer. And every task outside the cave required twice the effort it had only 2 weeks before. Eleanor could feel time closing around her. Food remained her greatest concern. Firewood could be gathered. Water could still be found beneath the limestone ridge. But food was disappearing one meal at a time. Each evening she calculated her remaining supplies. Each evening the numbers looked worse. On November 4th, she spread everything she owned across the pine bough floor and took inventory. 2 pounds of flour, a handful of dried apples, salt, a little coffee, several strips of salt pork. Not enough. Not nearly enough. Even with careful rationing, she would run short long before spring. That realization forced a decision. If she survived the winter, she needed a better way to store food. The cave offered little protection from rodents, moisture, and temperature swings near the entrance. She needed shelves, a pantry, a place where future supplies could be organized and preserved. The only available space was the rear wall, the same wall she couldn't stop thinking about, the same wall with the strange rectangular markings. For 2 days she ignored the coincidence. On the 3rd day, she finally accepted it. If she wanted a pantry, that was where she would build it. The following morning, she gathered her tools. There weren't many. A hammer, a small cold chisel she'd purchased months earlier in Cheyenne, a folding knife, and determination. That last one mattered most. The sun hadn't yet cleared the eastern ridge when she carried her lantern to the back of the cave. The limestone looked ordinary enough in the flickering light. Cold, gray, silent. She selected a point near chest height and positioned the chisel against the stone. Then she struck. The sharp crack echoed through the cave. A small chip broke free. Nothing unusual. She struck again. Another fragment fell. The work was slow but manageable. Limestone wasn't as stubborn as granite. With patience, she could shape a storage niche several inches deep. That was the plan. At least, it was the plan for the first hour. By mid-morning, she'd removed a shallow section roughly the size of a dinner plate. White stone dust covered the floor around her boots. Her shoulders ached. Her hands felt numb from the cold. She stopped to drink water and study her progress. The cavity looked promising, but something bothered her. The sound. Every strike carried a slightly different tone than she'd expected. Not wrong, just different. As though the stone behind the wall wasn't entirely solid. She dismissed the thought. Fatigue can play tricks on a person's senses. So she resumed working. Another dozen strikes. Another dozen chips. Then it happened. The hammer came down. The chisel bit into the limestone. And a deep hollow note echoed through the cave. Eleanor froze. The sound vanished instantly. Yet she knew she'd heard it. A low resonance. Not the sharp report of solid stone. Something else. Slowly she lowered the hammer. The cave became silent again. She placed her palm against the wall. Cold limestone. Nothing more. For several seconds, she remained motionless. Listening. Thinking. Then she raised the hammer again. This time she tapped lightly. The tone returned. Faint, but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She moved the chisel several inches to the left and struck once more. Solid. A sharp crack. No resonance. She moved it back. Tapped again. The hollow note returned. Eleanor stared at the wall. Every instinct told her she had discovered something important. She just didn't know what. For the rest of the afternoon, she stopped carving and started testing. Instead of cutting deeper, she mapped the sound. A strike here. A tap there. Marking locations with bits of charcoal. Slowly a pattern emerged. The hollow area wasn't random. It formed a shape. A rectangle. Nearly 5 feet wide. 4 feet high. Almost identical to the strange discoloration she'd noticed days earlier. By sunset, she sat cross-legged on the floor staring at the charcoal marks. The outline was impossible to ignore now. Nature hadn't made that shape. Someone had. The realization filled her with equal parts excitement and unease. Because if a person had altered this wall, why? The cave was hidden, remote, far from settlements. What purpose could justify this kind of work? That night, she barely slept. Questions chased one another through her mind. Was there a storage room behind the wall? An abandoned mine shaft? A root cellar? Something else entirely? The possibilities seemed endless. The next morning, she returned to work before sunrise. This wasn't about building shelves anymore. The pantry had become an excuse, a doorway to a mystery she could no longer ignore. Hour after hour, she chipped away at the limestone. Dust filled the air. Fragments scattered across the floor. The cavity deepened. For inches, then 5, then 6. Near midday, the chisel suddenly punched farther than expected. Only an inch, perhaps less, but enough. Eleanor felt it immediately. The resistance changed. The wall felt thinner, much thinner. Her heart began pounding. She brushed loose dust away and leaned closer. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed it. A narrow crack, barely visible, no wider than a knife blade. Darkness waited beyond it. Not stone, not limestone. Darkness. A space. An empty space hidden inside the mountain. Eleanor slowly backed away. For a long moment, she simply stared at the crack. Every hardship she'd endured since arriving at the cave suddenly felt very far away. Because for the first time, she knew with absolute certainty that someone had been here before her. And whoever that person was, they had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep something hidden behind that wall. I've often believed there are moments in a person's life when the future splits in two. One path leads back toward the life they expected. The other leads somewhere entirely unknown. Eleanor stood at that crossroads on the afternoon of November 8, 1887. Only her crossroads happened to be a crack in a limestone wall. The narrow opening stared back at her from the rear of the cave. No wider than a knife blade. No larger than a promise. Yet everything about it felt significant. For several minutes, she simply stood there, lantern in one hand, chisel in the other, trying to decide what to do next. Part of her wanted to leave it alone. Winter was already arriving. Food remained scarce. Firewood required constant attention. There were 100 practical reasons to focus on survival instead of mysteries. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and loneliness makes it stronger. The longer she stared at that dark crack, the more impossible it became to ignore. Someone had hidden something behind this wall. That much was certain. The only question was what. She set the lantern on the gravel floor and knelt beside the opening. Carefully, she inserted the tip of her knife into the crack. The blade disappeared farther than it should have, farther than solid stone would allow. Her pulse quickened. There was empty space behind it. A lot of empty space. Slowly, she began widening the opening. Not recklessly, patiently. Every strike of the hammer was measured. Every fragment of limestone removed with care. The work consumed the remainder of the afternoon. Dust coated her clothes. Her shoulders burned. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. Yet she never considered stopping. The mystery had become larger than hunger, larger than fatigue, larger than fear. By sunset, the opening measured nearly 10 inches across, large enough to peer through. Eleanor lifted the lantern and held it close. Warm yellow light slipped into the darkness beyond. At first, she saw nothing. Then shapes began to emerge. A floor, flat and level, not natural stone, constructed stone. Her breath caught. She moved the lantern slightly higher. The light reached farther. A wall, straight, vertical, built by human hands. Not a cave chamber, not a mine tunnel. A room. There was a room hidden behind the cave wall. Eleanor pulled back immediately. Her heart hammered against her ribs. For a moment, she simply sat there staring at the opening. The mountain suddenly felt alive. Not dangerous. Watching. Waiting. As if the secret beyond the wall had been expecting someone to find it. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. Wind moved through the pines. The temperature dropped rapidly, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the hidden room. She considered entering immediately, then stopped herself. Years later, when people heard her story, many asked the same question. Why didn't she crawl through right away? The answer was simple. Frontier people learned caution. Curiosity might open a door. Carelessness could close a coffin. So instead of rushing forward, Eleanor spent the night preparing. She sharpened her knife, checked her lantern fuel, packed extra matches, made certain her revolver was loaded. The old Colt had only 4 cartridges remaining, but 4 was better than none. Sleep came slowly. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the room beyond the wall. Who built it? Why hide it? Why seal it away? The questions followed her into her dreams. Before dawn, she was awake again. The cave felt colder than usual. The mystery felt larger. She ate a small breakfast of coffee and dried apples, then carried her lantern to the opening. The silence inside the cave seemed absolute. Even the wind outside sounded distant. She knelt, took a breath, and crawled through. The lantern entered first, then her shoulders, then the rest of her body. The opening scraped her coat as she squeezed through. For a brief moment, she found herself trapped between two worlds. The cave behind her, the unknown ahead. Then she emerged onto solid stone and stood. The lantern light pushed outward into darkness. What it revealed stole the breath from her lungs. The room was enormous, far larger than anything she had imagined. At least 30 feet long, perhaps 20 feet wide. Its ceiling curved gracefully overhead in carefully fitted limestone arches. Every stone had been shaped and placed with remarkable precision. This wasn't crude frontier work. This was craftsmanship. The floor had been leveled. The walls were straight. The entire structure felt permanent, intentional, as though someone had dedicated years of their life to building it. Then she noticed the furnishings. A wooden table, shelves, a cast-iron stove, a rocking chair sitting quietly beside the far wall. The chair stopped her cold. For reasons she couldn't explain, that simple object felt more unsettling than anything else. A stove could be abandoned. Shelves could be forgotten. But a rocking chair suggested a life. A person. Someone who had sat there countless evenings watching firelight dance across stone walls. Someone who had called this place home. The lantern continued moving. Its glow reached the shelves. Glass jars lined them. Dozens of jars, perfectly arranged, still standing exactly where they had been left. Then her eyes found something else. A framed photograph resting on the table. Beside it sat a leather-bound journal. And beneath a thin layer of dust, both appeared untouched. Eleanor slowly crossed the room. Every footstep echoed softly against the stone. The journal waited on the table, silent, patient, like it had been waiting years for someone to open it. She reached out, placed her hand on the worn leather cover, and discovered something stamped into the front. 3 initials. JTH. Whoever had built this hidden frontier homestead had left a name. And for the first time since breaking through the wall, Eleanor realized she wasn't just uncovering a shelter. She was uncovering someone's entire life. The journal felt heavier than it should have, not because of its size, because of what it represented. For nearly 3 weeks, Eleanor had believed she was alone in the Wyoming wilderness. Now she stood inside a hidden stone homestead buried within a mountain, holding proof that another human being had once lived there. And not just lived there, built it. Every shelf, every wall, every carefully fitted stone. Someone had imagined this place long before she arrived. Slowly, she opened the journal. The leather creaked softly. Dust drifted through the lantern light. The first page contained only a name. Jonathan Thomas Hale. Below it was a date. May 3rd, 1848. Eleanor stared at the writing. The ink had faded slightly, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. 40 years. The journal had been sitting there for nearly 40 years. She carefully turned the next page. The first entries were brief. Simple notes. Weather observations. Supply inventories. Mentions of hunting trips. Yet as she continued reading, a picture began to emerge. Jonathan Hale had arrived in the valley alone. No wife. No children. No partners. Only a wagon, 2 horses, and an impossible dream. He intended to build a home that could survive anything. Blizzards. Drought. Fire. Raiders. Time itself. Eleanor found herself sitting in the rocking chair without realizing it. The chair groaned softly beneath her weight. The lantern flickered. Outside, wind moved across the ridge. Inside, it felt as though Jonathan Hale were speaking directly to her through the pages. One passage caught her attention immediately. October 11th, 1852 *. A cabin can burn. A barn can collapse. A roof can blow away. Stone beneath a mountain answers to none of those things. She read the line twice. Then a third time, because suddenly the hidden homestead made sense. This wasn't merely a shelter. It was a fortress, a refuge designed to disappear, a place that could survive when everything else failed. Eleanor spent hours reading. The story unfolded year by year. Jonathan had spent nearly a decade expanding the hidden structure, digging, carving, hauling materials, building slowly whenever weather and supplies allowed. Some years he made great progress, others almost none, but he never stopped. Then, roughly halfway through the journal, the tone changed. The entries grew shorter, more personal, more reflective. The loneliness began appearing between the lines. One entry described spending Christmas completely alone. Another mentioned not hearing another human voice for nearly 6 months. A third simply read, asterisk, the silence feels larger every year. Asterisk, Eleanor paused after reading that sentence. For a moment she forgot about Jonathan, forgot about the mountain, forgot about the mystery, because she understood exactly what he meant. She had only been alone a few weeks, yet she already knew how silence could press against a person's thoughts, how it could grow heavier than hunger, heavier than cold. For the first time, she felt connected to the man who had built the hidden homestead. Not because of the structure, because of the loneliness. Hours passed. Eventually, her attention shifted from the journal to the room itself. She began examining the shelves more carefully. Many jars stood empty. Others still contained preserved foods that had long since spoiled. A few held items she couldn't immediately identify. Tools occupied another shelf. Hand-forged hinges, masonry chisels, measuring instruments. Everything arranged with extraordinary care. Jonathan Hale had been the kind of man who believed every object deserved a place. Then Eleanor noticed something unusual. One section of shelving appeared shallower than the rest, only by an inch or two, barely noticeable, but enough to attract her attention. The moment she saw it, the familiar feeling returned. The same feeling she'd experienced when studying the strange wall in the cave. Something wasn't quite right. She approached slowly. Lantern raised. The shelves appeared normal. Yet when she tapped gently against the wooden backing, the sound changed. A hollow sound. Her heart skipped. Not again. The realization almost made her laugh. She had discovered a hidden room, and now she might have discovered another secret inside it. Carefully, she inspected the shelf. One board showed slightly more wear than the others. The edges were smoother, handled more frequently. She pressed against it. Nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. Then she noticed a small iron peg hidden beneath the lowest shelf. The peg looked decorative, but Jonathan Hale didn't strike her as a decorative man. She pulled it. A soft click echoed through the room. The shelf shifted outward less than an inch. Eleanor froze. For several seconds, she simply stared. Then she slowly pulled. The entire shelving section swung open like a concealed door. Behind it was a narrow compartment built directly into the stone. Inside rested a wooden box. Nothing else. Just a single wooden box. Small, dust-covered, locked. Eleanor carefully lifted it into the lantern light. The box wasn't large, perhaps 18 inches long, yet it felt surprisingly heavy. Very heavy. A strange mixture of excitement and apprehension washed over her, because she suddenly realized something important. Jonathan Hale had hidden this box inside a secret compartment, inside a hidden room, behind a concealed wall. Whatever rested inside had mattered enough for him to protect it from the world. The question was why. And as Eleanor turned the box over in her hands, searching for a way to open it, she noticed a folded piece of paper attached to the underside. A note, addressed to whoever found it. Her pulse quickened, because after 40 years of silence, Jonathan Hale was about to speak again. For a long moment, Eleanor simply stared at the note. The wooden box rested in her lap. The hidden compartment stood open behind her, and the lantern cast long shadows across the stone walls of Jonathan Hale's forgotten homestead. Outside, wind swept through the valley. Inside, it felt as though time itself had stopped. Carefully, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting matched the journal. Strong, precise, unmistakably Jonathan's. The message was short. If you're reading this, then you've already found more than most men ever would. Before you open the box, finish the journal. There are things you need to understand first. Asterisk, that was all. No explanation. No instructions. Just a warning. Eleanor looked down at the box. Every instinct urged her to force it open immediately. Whatever was inside had been hidden behind a secret compartment for decades. But another part of her, the patient, practical part that had carried her across Wyoming alone, told her to listen. Jonathan had left those words for a reason. Reluctantly, she set the box aside. Then she returned to the journal. The entries that followed felt different from the earlier ones. Darker, more urgent. Jonathan was older now. The confident builder who had spent years carving a fortress into the mountain was beginning to sound like a man preparing for something. Or someone. One entry from 1863 caught Eleanor's attention immediately. The railroad will change everything. Towns will grow. Roads will come. But someday another hard winter will arrive, and someone will need this place more than I do. Asterisk, she read the sentence twice. Then 3 times. Someone. Not himself. Not his family. Someone else. A stranger. The idea unsettled her. Who spends 20 years building a hidden refuge for people he may never meet. The deeper she read, the stranger the story became. Jonathan described leaving supplies in carefully hidden locations throughout the valley. Emergency caches, firewood sheds, water barrels, tools sealed inside stone markers. At first, Eleanor assumed he was preparing for disasters. But gradually another possibility emerged. Jonathan wasn't preparing for himself. He was preparing for future survivors, future travelers, future lost souls, people like her. The realization lingered in her mind as she turned page after page. Then she reached an entry dated February 14th, 1868. The handwriting was noticeably shakier. I buried Thomas today. That was all the entry said. Nothing more. No explanation. No details. Just one sentence. The following pages filled in the story. Thomas Avery. A trapper. A friend. Apparently the only person who had ever discovered the hidden homestead while Jonathan was alive. The 2 men had survived 3 winters together. Worked together. Hunted together. Built together. Then Thomas died during a severe blizzard. For several pages afterward, Jonathan barely mentioned construction. Instead, he wrote about grief, loneliness, regret. Eleanor found herself slowing down. The words no longer felt like journal entries. They felt like conversations, confessions, the private thoughts of a man who knew no one would ever hear them. Then she reached the final section. The entries were separated by months instead of days. Jonathan's health was failing. He mentioned weakness, persistent coughing, difficulty working. The handwriting became uneven. One passage stopped Eleanor cold. Asterisk, the mountain will outlive me. That's as it should be. The shelter was never meant to belong to one man. Asterisk, she sat back in silence. The lantern crackled softly. The old rocking chair creaked beneath her weight. For the first time, she understood. Jonathan Hale hadn't built the homestead to escape the world. He had built it to serve the world. Not governments. Not railroads. Not towns. People. Ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. People exactly like Eleanor. Hours passed. Eventually, she reached the final page. The last entry was dated September 3rd, 1871. 16 years earlier. Jonathan wrote only a few paragraphs. He explained that he was leaving the valley. His health had worsened. Traveling east offered his only chance of receiving medical treatment. He doubted he would return. Then came the final lines. If fate is kind, another traveler will find this place someday. If that traveler is alone, tell yourself what I told myself. You are not as abandoned as you feel. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. For weeks, she had carried the weight of isolation. The deaths of her parents. The uncertainty of her future. The fear that nobody in the world cared whether she survived. And now a man she'd never met had somehow spoken directly to those fears. Across 16 years. Across silence. Across time itself. The room felt different now. Not abandoned. Inherited. As dusk settled outside the mountain, Eleanor finally turned toward the wooden box. Jonathan had told her to finish the journal first. Now she understood why. The box was no longer the mystery. Jonathan Hale was. And somehow that made opening the box feel even more important. She carried it to the table, examined the old brass lock, then noticed something she had missed before. A small key hung from a leather cord attached to the underside of the table, waiting, as though Jonathan had known exactly where her eyes would eventually fall. Eleanor slowly removed the key. The brass felt cold in her hand. Her pulse quickened, because after weeks of mystery, months of survival, and 40 years of silence, she was finally about to discover what Jonathan Hale had considered important enough to hide from the entire world. Eleanor sat at Jonathan Hale's table with the key in one hand and the wooden box in the other. For several seconds, she did nothing. The mountain was silent. The lantern flame swayed gently. Outside, snow had begun falling across the Wyoming hills. The first true storm of the season had arrived. And somehow that felt appropriate. Because Jonathan Hale's story was finally reaching its end. Slowly she inserted the brass key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first. Then, with a soft metallic click, it turned. Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside she expected gold, land deeds, money, something valuable enough to justify decades of secrecy. Instead, she found something far more surprising. Letters. Dozens of them, carefully bundled with leather straps. Beneath the letters rested several folded maps, a silver pocket watch, and a sealed envelope bearing a single handwritten message. For the one who finds this place. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The paper inside contained only 2 pages. But those pages would change her life forever. Jonathan's handwriting filled every line. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then my shelter has done exactly what it was built to do. Asterisk, asterisk, it found you when you needed it most. Asterisk, Eleanor swallowed hard. The words felt personal, as though Jonathan were sitting across the table speaking directly to her. She continued reading. Jonathan explained that the letters belonged to people he had helped over the years. Travelers, widows, homesteaders, lost prospectors, families trapped by storms. Many had stayed in the hidden homestead temporarily before continuing their journeys. Some left letters of gratitude. Others left updates years later. A few simply wanted him to know they survived. Jonathan had saved everyone. Then came the sentence that stopped Eleanor cold. Asterisk, you are not the first person this mountain has rescued. Asterisk, she looked around the room. The stone walls suddenly seemed different. Not empty, not forgotten. Filled with lives. Filled with stories. Filled with people who had once sat exactly where she sat now. People who had been frightened, hungry, alone, just like her. For the next several days, a powerful blizzard swept across the valley. Snow buried the ridge. Temperatures plunged below zero. Wind screamed through the darkness each night. Yet for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Eleanor wasn't afraid. The hidden homestead performed exactly as Jonathan had designed it. The stone walls trapped warmth. The stove heated the room efficiently. Hidden storage rooms contained enough preserved food to supplement her dwindling supplies. While the storm raged outside, she read. She read every journal entry, every letter, every story left behind. By Christmas, she felt as though she knew dozens of people she had never met. A widow from Montana, a trapper from Idaho, a young family traveling west, a Civil War veteran searching for a fresh start. All of them had passed through the mountain. All of them had survived because of Jonathan Hale's work. And gradually Eleanor began understanding something even more important. The homestead wasn't the true inheritance. The knowledge was. Jonathan had left detailed instructions on food preservation, stone construction, water collection, winter survival, livestock care, frontier medicine, everything he had learned over 20 years. He hadn't merely built a shelter. He had built a school, a legacy, a way for one survivor to help the next. Winter slowly surrendered to spring. Snow retreated from the hills. Creeks began flowing again. The valley turned green. And for the first time in months, Eleanor climbed to the ridge above the cave and looked toward the horizon. She wasn't the same frightened orphan who had arrived there the previous autumn. Jonathan Hale had changed that. The mountain had changed that. But perhaps most importantly, she had changed herself. One afternoon in April, while organizing supplies, Eleanor discovered several blank journals stored inside a cabinet. The sight made her smile, because suddenly she knew exactly what she needed to do. That evening she sat at the table, opened the first blank journal, and began writing. She recorded everything. Her arrival, the cave, the strange wall, the hidden homestead, the winter, the lessons she had learned, the mistakes she had survived. And on the very first page, she wrote a message intended for someone she would probably never meet. Someone who might arrive years later, perhaps decades later, lost, hungry, alone, exactly as she once had been. Years afterward, Eleanor eventually built a small ranch in the valley below. She married, raised children, and became one of the most respected women in the region. But she never revealed the location of Jonathan Hale's hidden homestead. Not publicly, not completely. She only shared it with those she trusted, people who understood its purpose, people willing to preserve it. When Eleanor died many decades later, one instruction appeared in her final papers. The mountain refuge must remain protected, must remain stocked, must remain available for anyone who truly needed it. And so the chain continued. Jonathan helping Eleanor. Eleanor helping the next traveler. The next traveler helping another. A legacy passed forward through generations. Now, whenever I think about her story, I realize the greatest mystery was never what existed behind the cave wall. It wasn't the hidden room, the secret compartment, or even the locked box. The real mystery was why one man would spend 20 years building a refuge for strangers he would never meet. And after reading every journal, every letter, and every page they left behind, I believe I know the answer. Jonathan Hale understood something most people never do. A shelter isn't measured by the stone that forms its walls. It's measured by the lives protected inside them. And somewhere in the Wyoming hills, hidden behind a simple cave wall, that truth still waits for the next person who needs it.